It was a beautiful evening in Los Angeles. The sun had just set, and the city lights sparkled like stars. In the heart of the city stood one of the most luxurious restaurants, a place where only the richest and most famous dined. The restaurant was known for its high-class service, expensive dishes, and strict dress code. Tonight, it was filled with wealthy businessmen, celebrities, and socialites enjoying their meals. Among them, a man walked in quietly. He wore simple clothes, an old black jacket, faded jeans, and worn-out boots. His hair was a little messy, and he carried himself in a relaxed, humble manner. Unlike the other guests, he had no expensive jewelry, no designer clothes, and no bodyguards following him. He looked just like an ordinary person. But what no one knew was that this man was Keanu Reeves, one of the most beloved actors in Hollywood. Keanu wasn't the type to show off his fame. He enjoyed simple things, riding the subway, chatting with strangers, and eating at small restaurants. But tonight, he decided to visit this luxury restaurant to see how things were running. It wasn't just any restaurant, it was his restaurant. However, almost no one knew that he owned it. He had bought it a few years ago, but he never talked about it publicly. He wanted the place to succeed on its own without using his name for promotion. As he stepped inside, he noticed the grand chandeliers, the polished marble floors, and the soft classical music playing in the background. The atmosphere was elegant, but there was also a sense of pride among the staff and customers. People were dressed in expensive suits and designer dresses, laughing and chatting about business deals and luxury vacations. No one even looked at Keanu as he walked in. He approached the front desk where a young hostess stood. She glanced at him for a second, and then, without a smile, asked, "Do you have a reservation?" Keanu shook his head. "No, but I was hoping to get a table." The hostess hesitated. She looked at his clothes again, then at the list in front of her. The restaurant was busy, but there were still empty tables. Yet, instead of offering him a seat, she frowned slightly. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked." Keanu smiled politely. "Are you sure? I can wait if needed." Before she could respond, a waiter nearby overheard the conversation. He was a young man, well-dressed, and full of confidence, but there was also a bit of arrogance in his tone. He walked over, looked Keanu up and down, and chuckled. "Sir, this is a luxury restaurant. Our meals are quite expensive." Keanu remained calm. "I understand." The waiter smirked. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." A few guests turned to see what was happening, some whispering among themselves. Keanu, still unfazed, simply nodded. "I'd still like to have a meal here." The waiter sighed, rolling his eyes, and reluctantly handed him a menu. He had no idea he had just insulted the owner of the restaurant. Keanu Reeves took the menu from the waiter and smiled politely. He didn't show any sign of anger or frustration. Instead, he calmly looked through the list of dishes, as if nothing had happened. The restaurant was filled with the soft clinking of glasses and the quiet hum of conversations. But a few customers had started paying attention to what was happening. Some glanced at Keanu with curiosity, wondering why a man dressed so simply was dining in such an expensive place. The waiter, whose name was Jake, stood nearby with his arms crossed. He had been working at the restaurant for over a year and took great pride in serving only the wealthiest and most well-known guests. To him, Keanu didn't look like someone who belonged in a place like this. He assumed the man was wasting his time. "Are you sure you want to eat here?" Jake asked with a slight smirk. "Our cheapest dish costs more than $100. Keanu looked up from the menu and nodded. "That's fine." Jake raised an eyebrow. "All right then," he said, still not convinced. "What would you like to order?" Keanu took his time, carefully reading through the options. He didn't rush, which seemed to annoy Jake even more. The waiter tapped his pen against his notepad impatiently, waiting for an answer. "I'll have the steak and a glass of red wine," Keanu finally said. Jake chuckled under his breath. "Good choice," he said sarcastically. "Would you like to see the prices first, just to be sure?" A few customers nearby overheard the comment and exchanged amused glances. Some of them whispered among themselves, laughing quietly. They assumed Keanu was an ordinary man who had somehow wandered into the wrong place. Keanu, however, remained completely calm. He didn't react to the rude remark. Instead, he simply handed the menu back to Jake and said, "No, thank you. I'll just have my order." Jake sighed and shook his head. "All right, but don't say I didn't warn you." As he walked away toward the kitchen, he whispered something to another waiter, who glanced at Keanu and laughed. Keanu noticed, but he didn't let it bother him. He had dealt with worse situations in life. This was nothing new. A few minutes later, Jake returned with a glass of wine and placed it on the table with a bit more force than necessary. "Your drink," he said casually. "Enjoy." Keanu picked up the glass, took a small sip, and nodded. "Thank you." Jake was confused. He had expected some kind of reaction. Maybe embarrassment, maybe frustration, but Keanu showed none of it. Instead, he sat quietly, enjoying his drink, as if he were completely at peace. What Jake didn't realize was that he had just insulted someone who had more power in this restaurant than he could ever imagine. As Keanu sat at his table, he could feel the eyes of several guests on him. Some were sneaking glances, whispering to each other. A few had already recognized him, but weren't sure if it was really Keanu Reeves, the famous Hollywood actor. Others simply assumed he was someone who didn't belong in such an expensive place. Jake, the waiter, still had a smirk on his face as he walked back to the counter. He leaned toward one of his coworkers and whispered, "That guy's going to be in for a shock when he sees the bill." The other waiter chuckled. A group of wealthy customers sitting nearby had also taken notice. One of them, a man in a sharp black suit, leaned toward his friends and said, "Looks like someone wandered into the wrong place." His friends laughed quietly, trying not to be too obvious, but the amusement was clear on their faces. Keanu, however, remained calm. He sipped his wine slowly, his eyes scanning the restaurant. He wasn't upset. Instead, he was observing, watching how the staff treated different guests, how they responded to people based on their appearance. He had visited many places before, but this was something he hadn't expected in his own restaurant. After a few minutes, Jake returned with the steak. He placed the plate in front of Keanu, but unlike the usual warm service given to other customers, there was no smile, no polite greeting, just a casual, almost dismissive, "Here's your food." Keanu looked up at him and gave a small nod. "Thank you." Jake raised an eyebrow, still expecting some kind of reaction. He wanted to see Keanu flustered, maybe struggling to figure out how to pay for the expensive meal. But nothing happened. Keanu simply picked up his fork and knife and started eating, as if he didn't have a care in the world. The rich man in the suit, watching from a nearby table, leaned over again and said loudly enough for others to hear, "I wonder if he knows how much that steak costs." His friends laughed again. Jake decided to take things a step further. As he passed by Keanu's table, he casually said, "Just so you know, sir, we don't do discounts." A few people chuckled. The tension in the air was growing, but Keanu still didn't react. Instead, he took another bite of his steak and simply nodded. "That's good to know." Jake was confused. Why wasn't this man getting embarrassed? Why wasn't he reacting like most people would? The waiter expected him to feel small, to regret coming in. But instead, Keanu remained composed, like nothing was wrong. What Jake didn't realize was that his moment of laughter was about to turn into a moment of shock. He had no idea that the man he was mocking wasn't just a customer. He was the owner of the restaurant. The restaurant continued to buzz with conversation, the sound of clinking glasses and soft music filling the air. But at Keanu's table, the atmosphere felt different. The quiet tension was growing, with a few more guests sneaking glances, curious about how things would unfold. Jake, the waiter, still had a smug look on his face. He believed he had made his point. In his mind, this man, who looked so ordinary, did not belong in a place like this. He was sure that any moment now, Keanu would realize his mistake and leave. But that moment never came. Instead, Keanu continued enjoying his meal, completely unbothered by the rude service. He wasn't upset. He wasn't embarrassed. He was just calm. Jake, frustrated by the lack of reaction, decided to take things further. He walked back to Keanu's table, this time with a forced smile. "Sir, I just wanted to remind you that we accept only credit cards, no cash." Keanu looked up, his expression still friendly. "That won't be a problem." Jake sighed. He had expected a different response. Before he could say anything else, one of the restaurant managers, a middle-aged man named Richard, noticed the situation. He had seen Jake speaking rudely to the customer multiple times. At first, he ignored it, assuming Jake was handling a difficult guest. But now, he felt he should step in. Richard walked over with an air of authority. He placed a hand on Jake's shoulder and turned toward Keanu with a polite but stiff expression. "Is there a problem here, sir?" he asked. Keanu wiped his mouth with a napkin and smiled. "Not at all. I'm just enjoying my meal." Richard glanced at Jake, then back at Keanu. Something about this man seemed familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. His clothes, his relaxed attitude, none of it fit the usual profile of their customers. Still, he wanted to make sure the restaurant's image remained intact. He turned back to Keanu and said in a measured tone, "Sir, we try to maintain a certain atmosphere here. Our guests expect a certain standard." Keanu raised an eyebrow, still smiling. "And what standard is that?" Richard hesitated. "Well, a certain level of sophistication. We prefer to serve guests who match the environment of our restaurant." Keanu chuckled softly. "You mean people who look wealthy?" Richard cleared his throat. "I didn't say that. But that's what you meant." Keanu's voice remained light, without a hint of anger. "Let me ask you something. Do you treat all guests like this, or just the ones who don't dress a certain way?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. Some of the guests nearby had gone silent, listening closely. Jake, meanwhile, was starting to look nervous. Richard forced a smile. "Sir, if you're unhappy with our service, perhaps another restaurant would be more to your liking." Keanu leaned back in his chair, sipping his wine. "That's an interesting suggestion, but I have a better one." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what would that be?" Keanu placed his glass down gently. "How about you bring me the owner of this restaurant? I'd like to have a word." Richard and Jake exchanged glances, both slightly amused. They had no idea that the owner was already sitting right in front of them. The restaurant manager, Richard, gave Keanu a puzzled look. The request was unusual. Most guests never asked to meet the owner unless they had a serious complaint or were important clients. Richard assumed that this man, dressed so simply, was making a desperate attempt to prove himself. Jake, the waiter, crossed his arms and smirked. "Sir, the owner of this restaurant is a very busy man. He doesn't have time to meet just anyone." Keanu smiled and leaned forward slightly. "Oh, I think he'd want to meet me." Richard sighed, glancing around. A few customers were now openly watching the scene unfold, curious to see where this was going. Some were whispering, wondering if the unknown guest was someone important after all. "Fine," Richard said, still dismissive. "I'll see what I can do." He turned and walked toward the back office, leaving Jake standing there, still smirking. "Good luck with that," Jake muttered before walking away. Keanu remained calm, sipping his wine and waiting patiently. A few minutes later, Richard returned, looking slightly confused. "Sir, the owner isn't available at the moment," he said carefully. Keanu chuckled softly. "Are you sure about that?" Richard frowned. "Yes, He stopped mid-sentence as Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small. He placed it gently on the table and slid it toward Richard. It was a business card. Richard hesitated before picking it up. The moment his eyes landed on the card, his face turned pale. His fingers trembled slightly as he read the name written on it. Keanu Reeves, owner. For a moment, Richard couldn't breathe. His heart pounded as he slowly looked up at Keanu, who was still smiling, his eyes calm but knowing. The entire room seemed to go silent. Jake, who had been standing nearby, noticed the change in Richard's expression and frowned. "What's wrong?" he asked. Richard swallowed hard, then turned to Jake with wide eyes. He's the owner." Jake's smirk disappeared in an instant. "What?" Richard turned back to Keanu, his voice shaky. I'm so sorry, Mr. Reeves. I didn't recognize you. If I had known." Keanu raised a hand, cutting him off. "So if you had known who I was, you would have treated me differently." Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Jake, meanwhile, felt his entire body go cold. He had been mocking, insulting, and belittling the very man who owned the restaurant. His legs felt weak as reality sank in. The other customers who had been laughing earlier now sat frozen, their faces filled with shock and embarrassment. Keanu sighed softly and looked around the room. "It's interesting, isn't it? How people judge others based on appearance." His voice was calm, but there was a weight to his words. No one said a word. The once lively restaurant was now completely silent. Jake, his face now red with shame, could barely stand still. He had just insulted the most important person in the room, and he knew that there would be consequences. The entire restaurant was silent. The sound of clinking glasses, quiet conversations, and soft music had all faded. Every eye was now on Keanu Reeves, the man they had ignored, judged, or even laughed at just minutes ago. The man they thought didn't belong in such a luxury restaurant was, in fact, the owner. Jake, the waiter, felt his heart pounding in his chest. His face was burning with embarrassment. Just moments ago, he had been mocking Keanu, assuming he was just another ordinary man who couldn't afford to eat there. But now, standing before the very person who owned the restaurant, Jake felt small. Richard, the manager, swallowed nervously. He had worked in fine dining for years, but he had never made such a big mistake before. His entire job was about treating important guests with respect, and yet he had failed to recognize the most important guest of all. Keanu remained calm. He looked at Richard and Jake, then glanced around the room. The other customers, who had been whispering and laughing earlier, now avoided eye contact. The rich man in the sharp black suit, who had made fun of Keanu, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. No one wanted to be noticed now. Finally, Keanu sighed and leaned back in his chair. He picked up his glass, took a slow sip of wine, and then placed it down gently. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "what happens now?" Richard quickly stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Mr. Reeves, I sincerely apologize. If I had known it was you." Keanu raised a hand, stopping him. "That's the problem, isn't it?" he said simply. "You only care because you found out who I am." Richard opened his mouth to respond but stopped himself. He had no excuse. Keanu turned to Jake, who was now looking down at the floor, too ashamed to meet his eyes. "And you," Keanu said. "You judged me the moment I walked in. You assumed I didn't belong here." "Why?" Jake stammered. I didn't know. I thought." Keanu tilted his head. "You thought I wasn't rich enough to be here." Jake said nothing. He just stood there, frozen in place. Keanu let out a small chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "It's funny," he said, "how people's behavior changes when they realize someone has power." Richard quickly nodded. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Reeves. Please, allow me to make it up to you. Your meal is on the house." Keanu gave him a long look. "Do you do that for all your guests, or just the ones who own the restaurant?" Richard had no answer. He could feel the weight of Keanu's words. Keanu looked around the room once more. The real test of character isn't how you treat people when they have money or fame. It's how you treat them when you think they have nothing. Jake and Richard stood still, knowing there was nothing they could say to fix what they had done. Keanu then leaned forward slightly and said something that made their hearts stop. "So tell me, do you think you should still be working here?" Richard and Jake felt their stomachs drop. The weight of Keanu's question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The once confident waiter and manager now looked pale and nervous. They knew this was serious. Jake swallowed hard. "Sir, I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He simply watched Jake, waiting to see if he had more to say. The silence felt unbearable. Jake took a deep breath and continued. "I judged you. I thought you didn't belong here just because of how you looked. That was wrong. I shouldn't have treated you, or anyone, like that." ***. Richard, the manager, stepped forward, nodding quickly. "Mr. Reeves, I take full responsibility as well. I should have corrected the behavior of my staff instead of making excuses." Keanu sighed, leaning back slightly. "So, do you think an apology is enough?" Both men hesitated. The truth was, they didn't know what to say. An apology seemed small compared to what they had done. They had disrespected the owner of the restaurant, the very man who paid their salaries. But beyond that, they had insulted a guest just because of his appearance. Jake, his hands trembling slightly, said, "I don't know if an apology is enough, but I truly regret my actions. And if you think I don't deserve to work here, I understand." Richard nodded. "I understand too. We let our judgment cloud our service, and that's not what this restaurant should stand for." Keanu tapped his fingers on the table, thinking. He wasn't an unreasonable man. He had faced much worse in his life, and had always believed in giving people a chance to learn from their mistakes. Finally, he spoke. "Firing you would be easy," he said. "But would that actually teach you anything?" Jake and Richard glanced at each other, unsure of what Keanu meant. Keanu continued, "A real lesson isn't just about facing consequences. It's about understanding why what you did was wrong, and making sure you never do it again." Jake nodded quickly. "I understand, sir. I'll never judge a guest like that again. I promise." Richard, wiping sweat from his forehead, added, "And I'll ensure that all staff members are trained to treat every guest with the same level of respect." Keanu studied them for a long moment, then finally smiled. "Good." Both men let out a quiet breath of relief, but Keanu wasn't done yet. "There's one more thing," he said. "I want both of you to personally serve the next 5 guests who come in, no matter what they look like, no matter how they're dressed, and I want you to treat them like VIPs." Jake and Richard nodded eagerly. "Of course, sir." Keanu smiled again, but this time it was a smile of understanding. "Then let's see if you've really learned your lesson." The room, which had been filled with tension just moments ago, now felt lighter. A lesson had been learned, but Keanu knew the real test was still to come. The atmosphere in the restaurant slowly returned to normal, but there was still a sense of anticipation in the air. The staff, the guests, and even the kitchen workers had witnessed an important moment, one that they wouldn't forget anytime soon. Keanu sat back in his chair, watching as Richard and Jake prepared themselves for their test. Their expressions were serious, determined. They knew this was their chance to prove that they had truly learned their lesson. Just then, the door opened and a man walked in. He was wearing old jeans and a faded hoodie. His hair was messy, and his shoes were worn out. He didn't look like the usual wealthy guests who dined at the restaurant. Jake and Richard exchanged a quick glance, but they didn't hesitate. Jake immediately stepped forward with a polite smile. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to our restaurant. May I take you to a table?" The man seemed surprised by the warm welcome. "Oh, sure, that would be great." Jake led him to a table near the window, pulling out the chair for him. "Would you like to see our menu, or would you prefer the chef's recommendation?" he asked with genuine politeness. Keanu watched closely, nodding in approval. The difference in Jake's attitude was clear. There was no sign of arrogance or judgment this time. Not long after, another guest entered. This time, it was an elderly woman with a simple handbag and a long coat. Richard was the first to greet her. "Good evening, ma'am. It's a pleasure to have you here. Let me help you to your table." The woman smiled warmly. "Thank you, young man. That's very kind of you." Richard walked her to a comfortable spot and made sure she had everything she needed. He even offered her a special tea, something he normally reserved for the most important clients. One by one, more guests arrived, and Jake and Richard treated each one with the same level of kindness and respect. It didn't matter if they were dressed simply or elegantly. Everyone was given the same VIP treatment. Keanu smiled as he watched. They had passed the test. As the evening went on, Keanu finished his meal and stood up. Richard and Jake hurried over. "Mr. Reeves, thank you for giving us a chance to prove ourselves," Richard said sincerely. Jake nodded. "I'll never forget this lesson. I promise to treat every guest with the respect they deserve." Keanu patted Jake's shoulder and smiled. "Good. That's how it should be." Before leaving, Keanu turned to the other guests and said, "You never know who's sitting next to you. The person you judge today might be the one who changes your life tomorrow. Always treat people with kindness." With that, he walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind a lesson that would stay with everyone forever. And from that day on, no guest in that restaurant was ever treated unfairly again.